Welcome. We have Gary Wayne back on. Gary, where can the listeners find your book and keep updated on your future works?
Well, the best way to get a hold of me is through my website, and that's the Genesis6conspiracy.com. That's Genesis 6 with the number 6conspiracy.com. And on that website, I have my book that's where I sell from, and it's got a generous excerpt on the book from all 98 chapters. So people like some of the things that I'm talking about, and what we're going to talk about today is, a lot of it comes out of what's written in that book. They'll get a good feel for themselves whether or not that's the right book for them. I have an ability for people to get a signed copy through that website. So I have a page for Canada, I have a page for the US, and I have a page for offshore. So best way to get a hold of the book is through my website. And if you're wanting to check out the availability for a digital book, you can link over from the Buy Now page to the Kindle version and get the digital copy. Or you can also link from there into barnesandnoble.com or amazon.com or amazon.ca. So lots of ways to get the book through the website. And if you're wanting to get a hold of me and say, can I get a document on, the day 6 people, for example, then, or whatever topic you might be interested. If I've got a document, just contact the author off of that website, and it may take me up to a month to get back to you, but I will get back to you. And if I've got a document, I will send it to you. If you've got a question, I will answer the question. And if you've got a comment, depending on what the comment says, I may or may not get back to you. So,
hey, being honest, right?
And then the other way to get a hold of me is on Messenger, and I'm trying to limit access to me through these two avenues because, as you can tell, I'm a month behind on correspondence. I'm trying to catch up, but and I don't want people not to contact me. It's just that typically the questions take time. I have to send documents. It's a long answer.
Mm-hmm.
So, and I love doing it, but I kind of bring it upon myself. But you know what? It's like doing this show. I mean, I don't do it for the money. I don't do it for anything other than the love of doing the research that I do, and then communicating that to people, and hopefully helping people find their own sort of curiosity. First, raise that curiosity, and then find some of their answers that they're looking for. Because we're all here to figure out why we're here, where we came from, and where we're going.
Right. Great. Now, this episode is very controversial regarding Adam and possibly people before Adam. And there's some passages in Genesis 1 that if you can cover off for the listeners so they can come to their own conclusions, doing their own research. And please, listeners, take notes so you can study it on your own and just listen intently. Re-listen to this podcast if you need so. And Gary, take it away. How do we today's believers reconcile that? Were there people before Adam?
It's a really important question, and they'll come out of this some questions, maybe even what might have happened before that. But that's another show. Mm-hmm. We won't have time to cover both aspects of that. But if we look at what is going on in Genesis 1, and then we look at what is going on in Genesis 2, the sort of typical kind of understanding of this book is these two chapters is chapter 2 is adding additional information to Genesis 1. And I think it does. But there are some interesting things that are different in the two books, or in the two chapters. And so much so that it's difficult to reconcile. In fact, mm-hmm. I tried many times to reconcile, and I cannot. When I read it under the lens of the standard dogma that is taught in the churches. And so I do not believe the Bible is in contradiction. As the Word of God, it needs to be perfect. So you can't have contradiction. So if you can't reconcile it as being the same accounting of events, then there has to be another answer. And then that answer actually starts to provide significant answers to just a whole host of other questions that people have. It just starts to connect some of the dots. So you have a creation that is going on in Genesis 1 that may actually include two different creation stories, but we're just going to deal with Genesis 2 forward and then compare that to Genesis 1, 2 forward, and then compare that to Genesis 2. And the first thing that sort of goes on in Genesis 1 is that we get introduced to, from a poorly translated version into English, because I think the English translations take too many shortcuts and don't give you the full context of the Hebrew. So, but we are introduced to a concept that is called Elohim in Genesis 1, and that's the word that shows up as God in most English translations. And Elohim is basically the plural of a few words that are making up a stream of words that begin with El and Elah, which would be the female format, and with the I am generally is the male plural aspect. But Elohim is plural of El. And what it's telling us is that these aren't just angels, as some people believe. Some people who will look at that and say, well, that says that the fallen angels probably did the first creation, except this is used in the superlative nature. And so if we understand that this is the triune of God's the three beings at work. You have God who commands the creation. You have the Word who creates everything. And then you have the Spirit hovering over the earth that's going to provide the life spirit of God to all things that are being created in terms of a living being that are all involved. So that's the Elohim. But what's really odd is that in Genesis 2, it starts off with Elohim as we're dealing with day 7. But in Genesis 2, verses 4 through 7, we start to get an introduction to Lord God. Mm-hmm. And again, I'm not happy with the Lord translation there necessarily either. I like the God aspect, but I don't like the Lord God aspect of the translation, because you have Jehovah Elohim is now introduced to us. And so you're basically being told there's two names to the Godhood, yes, in unity, but what it actually is saying is Jehovah of the Elohim. And when you understand Elohim as the God, and the three of them together, but the God Most High is as a complete unit, then that's Ha Elohim. So it actually, we should have Jehovah of the God unity of the three. So we have an introduction, Jehovah, and that's the I am of the Exodus story. And so this is the Word of God that is being introduced to us for a commission that is going to be breathed into Adam as a separate creation that will be a resolution to the angelic rebellion. So this whole creation part that we're talking about now is how the angelic rebellion gets resolved, which denotes that there are fallen angels. And when did they rebel? But just sort of hold that kind of thought. So when I talk about that there are details that are different, that's the first difference that denotes that there's something different. But there's lots of differences. I won't go through all of them, but I'll give you an idea here that there are ones that, are significant. And one of them is, if you go through, you have a different chronology of the days of creation that are being talked about. They're in a different order if you do a direct comparison. And people, we're going to give you a lot of information here, but know that you can get a hold of me through the website or through Messenger, and I have a document that details what I'm talking about, and I also have a comparative chart for people to look at. So I'll send you both on that if people get a hold of me. Now, to give an idea, some of the differences is you have God creating them in Genesis 1, male and female. And they're told to multiply and spread out around the earth. That's in Genesis 1:27 and 1:28. And that's not what happens with the creation of Adam. He is created in singular, and he is put in the Garden of Eden. And sometime later, Eve is created from a rib. But yet in Genesis 1, they're created at the same time and in multiple numbers. And one deduces in multiple races within the human races. So the four colors of races that we would sort of boil them down to their basic entities. But we also know that Adam is of the same species, of the same being. He may be of a different race within the same species, but he's of the same species. And so the word Adam is the word that is used for male in the creation of day one. And Adam is introduced as a man, which goes back to Adam, and then he becomes called the Adam, so the Ha-Adam. This is of a new creation for a special commission. And so the people of day 6, they're told that they can eat of anything that they want throughout the whole world. And they're essentially described as hunters and gatherers. But the people of Adam and then Eve, they're told that they can eat of anything within the garden, not the whole world, anything of in the garden, anything that they're growing except for one tree. Mm-hmm. And yet people of day 6 can eat from all of the trees. You've got God breathing the breath into Adam for this commission. You don't get any of that that's talked about in Genesis 1. You have in day 5, as another example of the differences, is you have a creation that comes out of the water when God said, "Let the waters abound with the abundance of living creatures." But in Genesis 2, it's out of the ground. Mm-hmm. And the difference here is that you have the winged birds and the great sea creatures, but it's the words and the land creatures that are being talked about, not the land creatures, but the bird creatures of day 5 versus coming out of the water. But in Genesis 2:12, the birds are included in that part of the creation. So when we look at all of the differences, and I have not listed them all because I don't want to sort of litigate every word. I just want to give people an idea that there are issues here that aren't really explainable. And then when you get Cain leaving Eden, or after Adam and Eve are ostracized out of Eden, after Cain kills Abel and they start to produce, Cain is ostracized for his crimes, and he is going to go east of Eden. He's going to go to the land of Nod, and he's going to build a city. But at this point in time, there's only Adam and Eve and Cain, and Abel is dead. Seth isn't even born yet. In fact, Seth is born when Adam is 130 years old, and this is very early in Cain's life because he's giving the first fruits of the offering, but doesn't give the first fruits, which is one of the big crimes or the sins that he does versus what Abel does, and why Abel's blessing is granted as being, truthfully and in the spirit of what he's supposed to be doing with the first fruits. And so Cain receives a wife. We're not told from where, and he has a son named Enoch or Hanok, and he builds a city for his wife and one son. Mm-hmm. But he's not building a city for them. He's building a city for people that are already living there. It's an existing place with an existing name. Mm-hmm. Cain shows up and marries one of these individuals. And the only place you can account for these individuals is that they are the day 6 people. You do not have any sons and daughters that are created until after Seth is born, when Adam is 130 years old. And then it's only told he has other sons and daughters. So this is after. And I look at the Bible is generally written in a chronological way, that it starts in Genesis, it ends in Revelations. It has a story that is going forward in a direct chronology, very linear. And if you get books that might be not quite in order, that would be like the books of the prophets, for example, and they'll give you the markers and the datings and the kings and whatever references you need to slide into that chronology. So you have Genesis 1, you have Genesis 2, you have Genesis 3, where you have the fall, you have Genesis 4 with the Cain story and his descendants and his lineage, which is directly opposed to the Sethian line. And all of a sudden, you're into a whole area of how does this make sense with what I just read in the first few chapters?
Yeah, and another thing that I wanted to point out, in Genesis 2:7, it says, "The Lord God formed man of the dust of the ground, and breathed the life into his nostrils." Now, and in 1 Corinthians, I believe there is a natural body, right? G5591, and the principle for animal life, and there's a spiritual body, G4152. So my question is, so these people before Adam, they didn't have the special spirit, right?
Sorry about that. They would have had a spirit of God somehow, some way. So even animals have a spirit, right? So The question gets to be, is this part of the spirit that comes from God as the same spirit that is with humans? And because you have a different spirit between angels and humans, and you also have a different spirit between angels and the Word and the Holy Spirit and the God, who are all spirit beings.
Right.
And in heaven, angels are spirit beings, but in the earth, they take a physical form. So the question gets to be is, if the humans created in day 6 were created in God's image, they wouldn't have been created in an image of physical form, because God is in the triune of God, the three, the Word, the Holy Spirit, and God. As the Elohim, they would have been reflective of that spirit aspect, not of the physical aspect. So I think that spirit, comes from God. I think there's something unique that is being God breathed by Jehovah Elohim, because he's creating the people that he is going to have a body provided for him as to put his spirit in through Mary down the road, and will be how the angelic rebellion will be resolved is through the resurrection, and the whole sort of plan to, through free choice, allow all things to play out.
Right. And I see cognitive dissonance when it comes to the timeline. Many people are taught that this can't be so because Adam was 6,000 years ago. Now, my position on that is that timeline started when Adam was formed. I don't believe there was a time, put in order before Adam. I think from Genesis 1:1 to Genesis 1:27, or before Adam, there's no timeline of that. So go ahead. I'm sorry.
I was going to say, even if you apply the book of Peter to this, where it says a day is like 1,000 years to God, I think that's probably likely. I think you could probably apply that in this case. So we get 7 days of creation, or 6 days of creation and a day of rest. So if humans are created on day 6, I mean, that's 1,000 years, and then day 7 is another 1,000 years. Mm-hmm. But we don't get a day 8. We're not told about a day 8. Adam just sometime later. So you've got a couple of 1,000 years after the creation of day 6, and then some unaccounted for period. And the language is really quite interesting in Genesis 2, where it says, this is the history of the heavens and the earth when they were created in the day that the Lord made the earth and the heavens. And it is an accounting of those generations afterwards. So we have no idea how far down the road Adam is created. And one might even deduce that there would have been a spoiling of the earth by the rebellious angels after day 7, and that Adam, that is just going to further convict the fallen angels for the things that they're doing. And then Adam is created later, which is why you have a little bit different type of creation story in terms of the order as it's being introduced to Adam and within Eden. That starts to answer a few questions, but we need to sort of decouple this notion that the earth began when Adam was born.
Mm-hmm.
That's not what it says. It's sometime later. It's after day 7, and it's not day 8, because we're not told there's day 8. So there's a gap in there, and then there could be a significant gap in there.
So, with that being said, is it possible that Adam was 6,000 years ago? Because I have a question to follow that.
Yeah, if you track the genealogies and the dates forward or backwards from wherever you want to start, it's about 6,000 years.
Okay, because we had on another guest, Aaron Judkins, and we our topic was Göbekli Tepe, and that's 12,000 years ago. So I'm wondering, these people creating these megalithic temples, is it possible that these were a creation before Adam?
Yeah, they are. They're the hunters and the gatherers that we talked about of day 6.
That's interesting.
Because when you look at that, that's coming out of the Ice Age, of some sort of destruction that had happened.
Younger Dryas.
Yeah. And that they are going to go to Göbekli Tepe, or whether, and so many other sites where these hunters and gatherers show up without any skills of civilization, without an agricultural presence, without a knowledge, and all of a sudden they build these structures out of nowhere. Now, typically, the story from polytheism comes out from their history is that the gods provided them the knowledge. That's why it was so instantaneous, and they were able to build these things with that. And then the agrarian society comes later. Now, in the Adam story, these are the agrarians versus the hunters and gatherers. So if you look at the language in Genesis 1 or in Genesis 2 about planting of crops, about the planting of orchards, that this is running from the Nile to the Euphrates, that this has all sorts of animals being raised, probably wild and tamed ones, and that there's just one individual, and so much so that Adam needs a helper. But he doesn't go to any of the people that would have already been created in male and female. He actually creates a new one because he's trying to keep a separation and a continuance of this bloodline between Adam, and so Eve is created from the rib. And sometime after, we're not even told how long after. All we're told is Adam needs a helper.
Yeah, right. And that's another interesting thing.
Well, the helper couldn't come from the animal world.
No.
That would be crazy.
No.
So why would they be considering some sort of animal unless there's something like a hash being, right? That is an intelligent walking being.
Right.
Another rabbit hole, but different story.
Yeah, and a big rabbit hole. So we look at Cain going to Nod, and we see that through him, a lot of these giant tribes were created. Is it possible that these people before Adam had that gene, or maybe, the starry host came down and commingled? I mean, these are questions that I wonder about now, because if these day 6 people were bigger people, then we look into Atlantis, and we see Titans there too. I'm just wondering if these people were just somehow different, or were made different later by some kind of incursion.
No, you can certainly, kind of make that case, but that doesn't resolve why there'd be differences in the two creation stories, right?
Right.
And it wouldn't answer the question why Adam is the same male of the species as the man in day 6. So, because it's the same word. So you'd think there would be, God is so specific in the words being provided to us in the original languages that there would have been a different word that would have been selected for that. And it makes sense to me that if Cain was taught all of this knowledge by Adam on how to run an agrarian society and the understanding of, astronomy and everything else that it takes to go along with it, that when he went to Nod, that would be part of the knowledge he had to build Enoch City, his first son, he named after. Mm-hmm. And there's two Enochs, in case people haven't realized that. One of Cain, and then there's a son of Jared on the Sethian line, which went to heaven. So two different Enochs and two different impacts on prehistory, which is very important to understand and not conflate the two. And that Cain would have taught these agrarian things that he had learned in Eden. It makes sense. And that he was rebelling, so he'd be honoring and accepting of the gods who the day 6 people worship. Mm-hmm. And perhaps that worship before was also part of why you had the Ice Age as part of a destruction, and why you get a few different details of what's happening in what happens after the Ice Age with the creation of Adam, and that Cain is rebelled from God and is not going to follow God, so is very open to follow the fallen angels, which he would have been well aware of, and made a league with them. So much so, he's going to provide for down the road the daughters of humans that are going to copulate in Genesis 6 with the fallen angels, or the gods of the pantheon that he's worshiping. And so you get this sort of procession of this Canaanite evil that is developing knowledge, intermixing with the other day 6 people, creating this universal religion that's going to be over the earth except for the Sethian branch. And these people are going to be, when they're told to spread over the whole earth, if there was 5 continents at that time, they would have been on the 5 continents. If there was 3 continents, they would have been on 3 continents. But wherever the land was able for them to get to, and the technology that they were able to develop, they would have been settling through the Canaanites, and then particularly under the reign of the giants that are created by the sons of God, which are the watchers of the book of Enoch. And we get watchers 4 times in the Bible, in Daniel 4, which goes back to a Hebrew word ayir, which means a watcher angel, and those are typically understood as seraphim, ophanim, cherubim, and archangels. So, and typically the first 200 or so in the story, as Enoch talks about, whatever the number actually was, doesn't really matter, would have been the seraphim ones, which were the serpent-faced, dragon-like angels. So that's where I think a larger size starts to come in. Now, it doesn't mean that they weren't a little larger than humans, but they weren't the giants that the Nephilim were before the flood, or the Rephaim were after the flood.
Right. Well, that's an interesting take on it, and thank you for clarifying that. And we also see this backs up the people before Adam, and Matthew 19:4, it says, "And he answered and said unto them, Have ye not read that he which made them at the beginning made them male and female? And said, For this cause shall a man leave father and mother, and shall cleave to his wife." So that seems to be answering that, It
is. I mean, Jesus isn't referring to creating Adam and then Eve from the rib there. He is clearly referring in the beginning, in Genesis 1, the day 6 people. And that Adam is of the same species, and that they populate sort of in the same way, right? But there's, as I say, it's that different commission, that's the separation between the understanding there. And Jesus isn't being inaccurate, because he's saying in the beginning, which is denoting that Genesis 2 is at a different period.
Yeah, true. Also, the Assyrian tablets, they speak on the what they're known as the blackheads, and evidently these people were taught and directed by the Anunnaki. You want to call them Anunnaki, sons of God, or whatever. You know, I wonder, were the Blackheads part of the day 6 creation?
Yeah, they were, and they would have been probably part of the people that the Sethites were living close around too. But the Blackheads are one civilization.
Mm-hmm.
So they had black hair, and they're created by the gods, and they're polytheistic viewpoint of creation. And actually, there's a few different creations of these as you get into that whole mythos of Sumerian creation. But there's a creation story all around the world.
Mm-hmm.
Right? That is different than the Adam story.
Yeah, and that makes one wonder, you know, these people before Adam that's recorded around the world. I mean, it's possibly that they are what the other cultures recorded before and after the deluge, I would say.
Well, it would make sense that there would be a history of that, and then even again after the flood, you're going to have things that are found. You're going to have the gods that are being worshipped at that time, which are different than the gods before the flood. You have the offspring gods after the flood, the parent gods before the flood, and that they're also being taught knowledge while these gods walked amongst them before they too disappear, probably for the same crimes as the angels before the flood. And that they're going to have this knowledge of that creation, right? And it's going to be passed on through the gods. And if giants survive the flood, in terms of not being totally wiped out as opposed to being recreated, I'm a fan of the recreation, but I'm open to the understanding that they survived as well, because we don't have a smoking gun after the flood at some specific location where they're created. I can make a biblical case for that, and I have a document on that I think points towards that. But polytheism tends to look at a survival as well as recreations of giants after the flood. So the Epic of Gilgamesh, for example, is classic in that respect, because it has Gilgamesh, who in one version is, and in another version, I should say, who is recorded as a giant before the flood in the Enoch Book of Giants, who has foreknowledge of a catastrophe that's coming, likely a flood. And then you have Gilgamesh, who's created as 6th generation after the flood as king of Uruk, son of Lugalbanda, but his mother is a fertility goddess named Nin or Ninsun, depending on which translation that you're reading. And he's a demigod, 2/3 god, 1/3 human, and he's 19 feet tall and he's 7 feet wide. Like, he's a giant, not as big as before the flood, but that's right. A second incursion, just as Enkidu or Enkidu, depending on which translation you're reading, is created in the same way to try and offset the tyranny of Gilgamesh. But within the tablet stories, 12 tablets of the Epic of Gilgamesh, is the flood story with Utnapishtim, who takes all of his family with him, and they're all 2/3 god and 1/3 human. They are Nephilim. That's a Nephilim survival story, but it has a second incursion, and it has as a survival story. So my only point is if they actually survive the flood with fallen angelic help, then they would maintain the history as well.
Right. And going to back to Gobekli, there's some anthropomorphic columns that have they're headless, but they have 6 fingers, and I guess Derek Gilbert and Aaron Judkins came to a conclusion that they were probably worshiping Shemiyaza Azazel coming out of Haran. And so, obviously, you know, you're right on saying these were Gnostic believing peoples of before Adam, in my opinion.
Yeah, I mean, they are worshiping images of fallen angels. They're worshiping through astrology that comes through the astronomy science. So that's developed by Enoch, son of Cain. So again, you get this sort of linking up of what we can find to say that there was a worship of these fallen angels However, one wants to assemble the timeline that happens before the flood. And so things start to make some sense. And you don't get a fully developed agrarian civilization until about 4000 BC, no matter how the seculars or other contrarians want to put that timeline together. You've got maybe a blurb of agrarian capability that happens at Göbekli Tepe at, say, 8,000 BC, 8,500 BC, right after the what do they call it? The dry. I'm trying to think of the name.
Younger Dryas.
Something Dryas.
Yeah, Younger Dryas.
Yeah. What was that again?
Younger Dryas.
Younger Dryas. That's the word I'm looking for. Yeah. So because it's coming out of that ice age that starts to allow for civilization after about 10,000 BC. So you have this sort of development that's going on. But you have this consistency of a civilization worshiping gods, fallen angels, before Cain. So it's indicating there's a gap there, but not a fully fledged worldwide agricultural civilization that's going to happen in, depending on who you want to look at for research around the world. There's either 4 antediluvian civilizations, 7, and some say 11. I've even heard 13. I don't really buy into the 13, but 7 for sure, just as there were 7 holy mountains around the world. And so when you understand that the Sumerians were just one of those civilizations, then now you're opening up a scenario that at some point in time, the first major civilization, or perhaps they're all growing up independently, but there is going to be multiple advanced civilizations before the flood. And then that really starts to change your whole perspective in terms of how one may want to understand Genesis 1, Genesis 2, 3, 4 through 6, because Genesis 6 is the introduction of the flood story. So anything antediluvian, we need to start to look at the development of very technically, logically advanced civilizations all over the world that have the same technology of being agrarian, have the same technology in building, so that they will build the same type of pyramids all over the earth that we can't account for. And we know, for example, the Great Pyramid is dated before the flood. We know this, even though the Egyptologists say it's from Khafre and Khufu at about 2300 BC. That's probably more of a renovation. You see in the Stela of Menes or Narma, the first one of the kings of Egypt around using secular chronology of the seculars around 3000 BC, which is the time of the flood. You see depicted the 52-degree slope Great Pyramid in the background. And so most polytheists will even date those pyramids to an older date, just as they do with the Sphinx. And everything has an older time associated with it. And in polytheism, you have the gods first, who built the major great cities around the world, and then the civilization of humans, and merging with the 7 sciences that Cain and Enoch developed, that merges with the knowledge of the gods, that takes them to a level we're still catching up to.
Yeah. So with that being said about the pyramids, we see these, strewed all over the earth, under the ocean. Secular archaeologists, they really can't explain it, but it seems to be that this might have been during the age of Atlantis that this type of technology, architecture was developed. And with that being said, my question is, in the Critias and Timaeus of Plato, it speaks on that Poseidon had a human wife. I mean, is it possible that this wife was part of the people before Adam, and was Atlantis before the people? Well, the day 6 people, was it in that timeline in Genesis? And I believe somewhere in the Bible it talks about Tyre, the people of the oceans, and that island is no more. And we know that there's no island there. Is that a hint to Atlantis in the Bible?
Well, Gary, you there?
I think you're talking about Isaiah 23, and with the island of Tyre, as it's allegorized, that is thought to be Atlantis. And Tyre wasn't an island. It had a little peninsula, but it's destroyed by the waters of the sea. It's the city of old, the city of the proud, the city of the renowned, just as the mighty ones of old were renowned. So, and I'm going to sort of come back to some more biblical references for people maybe in a few minutes. And I thought I'd just sort of walk back just a little bit with what you were talking about and then move into the Atlantean story, because understanding Genesis 1 through 6 really makes sense with the Atlantean story, but make sure you measure everything against the Bible and not vice versa. It's just, if you're a Christian, just you can make it work. You just have to be disciplined on it. So you have, as you say, underground cities like Maliballipuram and Dwarka, which are destroyed in the same way as places like Atlantis, right? You have, according to the research of Paul Weinwig and Pauline Zalicki, you have pyramids from a city that are shown, and they have pictures of it, off the shore of Cuba. That's kind of connected in with the Bimini Road. And there's a lot of research out there now that's showing that those stones were elevated, and they were, part of probably not a road, but more of a larger city or a worship site. And so they were done in a way that couldn't be done natural. But what's also in there is there's a gigantic city there, and they have 4 pyramids there. There's sphinxes that are there. And it was first discovered during the Cuban Missile Crisis. But this is just a couple of the examples that this is a technology that was used all over the world, a knowledge that were all built with sacred sciences. They were built with a masonry to a level we can't do today, moving weights of stones we can't do today. And not only with similar sacred geometry to the religion, but sacred geometry to the dimensions of the world through radius and circumference and things like that, and then astrologically and astronomically aligned to the stars of the heavens. We can't do this today. So there was a significant technology that went on to build these cities. And so I wanted to just sort of underline that kind of first in terms of this common legacy that's around the world. And there's more sites. So you could show just on ancient sites, and you still couldn't cover them all, that are out of place with secular chronology, that make no sense. So they just ignore them. It's like finding what they call an UPART, an out of place artifact, that if you get an elongated skull or something, they're just not going to show it. They're going to go leave it in the back rooms, and they're not going to deal with it because they have no ability to deal with that. Now, Atlantis would be one of those civilizations that we're talking about, of likely 7 civilizations that would be the matching to the 7 ancient mountains around the world. And they were worshiping a pantheon of gods in Atlantis, which is the same pantheon of gods that was worshipped all around the world. They just have different vernacular names to it. So it doesn't matter whether or not, if you're talking, let's say, on the offspring god level, like a Zeus, that's the same as Osiris, or the same as Baal. And when you have the parent gods, you have the same sort of cross references as the same gods, just different names. Let's say you have Anu in Samaria, and you have Kronos in Greece. Right. So if we start to sort of understand that, the Atlantis story starts to make some sense to us. So Plato, he wrote two books that talks about Atlantis. One is Cretaeus and one is Timaeus. And he's telling a story, while he's detailing this, but the original information comes from the Egyptian priests, and down through Solon, who is from Greece, and he travels to Egypt, and he's shown these columns in Sais, S-A-I-S, in Egypt, and that he is told that this world that you're living in. There are older worlds that were destroyed by catastrophes.
Right.
And so he brings this story back, and it's the whole Atlantean story. And just to give a little bit of credibility to this, is that you have historians who are out of history that support the accuracy of it, like Plutarch and Diodorus and Pliny and Posidonius and Strabo. They're quoting from these to the accuracy of Plato's accounts through other histories and things that they wrote about. So this isn't just a science fiction movie. This is telling of an ancient civilization called Atlantis. And in the typical Atlantean story, from a post-Diluvian or after the flood perspective, you have a god named Poseidon.
Mm-hmm.
And he is going to marry a daughter named Evenor. I'm sorry, he's a daughter named Cleito, daughter of Evenor and Leucippe, who are typically understood as humans. And he's going to produce 12 demigod kings. 10 demigod kings. And this is going to form the Atlantean Empire that is trying to take over the whole world. And this is an advanced civilization understood to have great technology, was a polytheist religion, and had ambitions to be the world government. It was the center of civilization as the most advanced, and it was trying to expand through war, through the 10 Nephilim kings, to become a world government. And this was the golden age because they represented everything that was developed by the demigod sons and who reigned over the humans by that point in time. Now, Poseidon is an offspring god, and he is after the flood. So the story is accurate, but it actually goes back to an antediluvian story. So after the flood, you have gods like Poseidon moving up after that parent god was taken to the abyss for creating the giants. Now, Poseidon would have created his own giants as well. And just as Zeus steps up to take Kronos' position, and creates Hercules after the flood, as opposed to Hercules before the flood. And both sides of the flood, the gods created the giants. And so the antediluvian parent gods went to the abyss for their crimes. After the flood, you have offspring gods like Baal and Osiris and Poseidon. They're creating new giants, likely the Rephaim, and they're going to disappear too. But for a while, they walk amongst the humans, and then they go to the abyss. So what happens is they are part of the rebellious host of gods or angels as we would understand them biblically, and that means army, and that has rank and order. There's a hierarchy to the angelic realm and to the rebellious angelic realm, and part of that hierarchy includes who they create. And so you have people that move up in rank and order, just as you would have in an army to replace the ones that are disappeared. Now, in polytheism, they account for this by, let's say, Zeus killing Kronos, and it's the same story in all the different pantheons around the world. That's how they move up and take over. You can't kill an immortal. So we know biblically fallen angels go to the abyss until the end time. And so that's all that happened, is they just stepped up to take over after the flood and did the same types of things as their parent gods did. Now, biblically, Genesis 6 is the beginning of the flood story. So as the preamble, and there's no division between how it starts off in Genesis 6:1 to how the flood comes about, you have the giant creation story from the sons of God, Genesis 6:1 through 4. With Noah, he's introduced at the end of chapter 5 in the genealogies, and then reintroduced as as the introduction to his commission after Genesis 6:4, again including his sons, because he's going to be on a commission to try and get the giants to repent, but of course they don't, and he's going to be building the ark so that the 8 can survive the flood. And so you have the exact same story going on in Genesis 6:1 through 4, where you have angels, gods as they're known in polytheism, taking the daughters of Cain in this case, as opposed to the daughter Clydo of Evanor and Leucippe, and taking and creating giants or demigods. And in the Greek understanding of the ancient word of demigod, as it is in all polytheist cultures, that is the offspring of a god and a human female, or a goddess and a human male, as in the Gilgamesh after the flood story in Sumeria. Iapetus is accredited as also being the same god as Poseidon, but he's not. Iapetus was part of the parent god organizational structure under Kronos, god of the sea, but before Poseidon. And in the older story that was blended into the Poseidon story is you have him marrying a Titan Andes, a giant, as you would sort of understand that. But I think that's an elevation, just as all of the mother goddesses, all the females are raised to mother goddess status in the polytheist religions after the creation of the giants. But Iapetus marries a climbing individual, Clymene, and creates the giants. And typically, he's understood as creating similar giants to Poseidon, but as before the flood. But Poseidon's story is kind of a, jumping on of that story and taking credit for it. Not that Poseidon didn't create giants, because he did. But the one specifically that we get coming out of polytheist history is that Iapetus created Albion, Magog, and Gog.
Right. With
Gog and Magog showing up in the Bible.
The next question I wanted to ask you, it's in your book, chapter 20. Speaking on the dynastic, the pharaohs, it says in your book, the Shebtu consisted of 8 divine beings, the 7 fallen angels, and Satan, including Kema-Sata, the serpent creator of the earth. Now, it seems that these winged beings, the Anunnaki, Shebtu, Shebeti, I'm guessing that one of these entities was Shemiyaza Azazel that was venerated around the world, and we see other winged gods, the Naga and the Quetzalcoatl, and so many other gods. What's your take on the 7 sages plus Satan on David Roll's Legends of Genesis?
What we do know is that this is a worldwide story, and in my book I cover a number of those stories, not all, but a number of them, to sort of make a point that this is a common legacy that's in polytheism. So when we talk about the Shebtiu or the Sebeti or the 7 sages, we need to make a designation or a distinction that there are 2 different levels of this. So just as you have a demigod and you have a god, and a demigod is kind of an offspring of the god, you might look at the 7 sages as being demigods and created from the gods. But the The seven sages are a group of collection of seven gods that provided knowledge before the flood and knowledge again after the flood. And so the gods would be similar to what we would understand as the wandering stars in the Bible. So these are typically planets. So to sort of stay with the Greek mythology with Atlantis. So you have, as the part of the seven gods of the pantheon, just as you have seven gods that are named similarly for the for the 7 days of the week, but that's again another rabbit hole. You have Greece that have Kronos that's listed, that is represented as Saturn, so that's a parent god. You have Jupiter, which is represented as by Zeus, which is his offspring god. You have a sun god named Apollo. You have another offspring god named Artemis that represents the moon. Hermes for Mercury. Venus is Aphrodite, and Mars is Ares. That's in the Greek pantheon. And in the Roman pantheon, those are all just used as the planetary names for the same god. So they give it to you more directly. So in Egypt, those seven would be Jeb, Osiris, Ra, Isis, Thoth, Sekhmet, some people think Hathor, and Horus. And so you have the same sort of famous seven gods before and after the flood. They're kind of amalgamating from before and after, and that's just, again, showing that there was a change in power, and they're still trying to recognize their legacy, but it's the positions that they had that the offspring gods moved into when they're named. It was, holding the same place of authority and title. And so you have the Sheptiu gods, the Sabeti, providing knowledge to humans, and they create a priest class. Whether it's the Brahmins in India or it is the companions of Horus in Egypt.
Right.
It's the same group, and these are the demigods. Now, how that links into the flood is that you have seven survivors of these sages after the flood, which is kind of a common aspect. You don't get seven totally named at times, but Osiris is going around after the flood as providing knowledge everywhere. You have a different individual, and there's actually seven sages that are counted in the Indian epic. You have, as you said, Quetzalcoatl,
right,
providing knowledge and civilization after the flood from an island continent to the Kishamaya, right? So you have the same story of these gods that are providing knowledge after the flood. All it is the offspring gods who are doing it, because the parent gods would have been gone to the abyss. So gods like Osiris make a lot of sense, and Zeus, but they always like to have a parent god, a couple in each of those pantheons, just so that so it's for their own benefit of their history, and as an adept you would understand the reasons for that and why they chose those ones. I'm not an adept. In the Canaanite pantheon, so we can sort of get that back to the Bible, the wandering stars are El, the parent god, Baal, his offspring god, Shemesh, which is a sun god, Astarte, which is the moon god. You got Tout, and you've got, which is similar to Thoth, right? But it's called Tout, Astarte, and Molech. And Molech is the brother of Baal, or a son of Baal, depending on which version that you're reading out of history. So all of a sudden that starts to make some sense.
Yeah,
and you have civilization being restarted. You have, again, a recreation of giants again. Nothing is new under the sun after the flood. And knowledge starts off at a fairly high level, just as Nimrod is building Babel Tower after the flood and Babel City. And then you get a degradation of that knowledge because those gods who are supplying that knowledge directly are also taken to the abyss. And we know Baal creates the Rephaim. In the Ugaritic texts, he is the one who creates the Rapiu or the Rapium. And you have a council of the Datanu, which is the Tuatha De Danann, as they're accounted for in the Ugaritic text. And in the Ugaritic text, they're trying to bring back Baal and Ashtaroth to recreate new Rephaim because they have a fertility issue after the flood, which is different from before the flood. They produced in great numbers. But after the flood, they had some fertility issues. And so when you link that up to the terrible ones talked about in Ezekiel 32 and in the book of Isaiah, you have a word that is arit, or the retim. These are ones that were mighty and strong and did terrible things as tyrants while they were on earth, and many of who are in the sides of the abyss, both before and after the flood, as Ezekiel 32 talks about. But in that definition of the terrible ones coming out of the Strong's Concordance or Strong's Dictionary, I like the Strong's Dictionary preferably over the Concordance because you get a bigger definition in there. Those are ones who are also said to be childless and had fertility issues, and that's why they would have to intermarry with the Canaanites to replenish and produce the patriarchal bloodlines that are registered in Genesis 10. But it's the validity to the restart of the Atlantean civilizations or the antediluvian civilizations that spread out all over the world again to a similar 7 kinds of civilizations with 7 holy mountains.
Wow. That's a great explanation. It connected all the dots. In Genesis 6:4, I have a question here. There were giants in the earth in those days, and also after that, when the sons of God came into the daughters of men, and they bare children to them. The same became the mighty men which were old, olam, ancient, men of renown. Now, when it says old, are we talking in this passage past tense, like there were titans before this Genesis 6:4 event, maybe hinting at Atlantis? And what's the definition of renown, the translation of men of renown?
Yeah, it's important to sort of understand for context is that we receive Genesis and the first books of the Bible in about 1400 to 1450 BC via Moses, who receives this information from God, right? So we need to understand that they're looking back at this. Mm-hmm. And so the times of old, the ancient times, old, there's a number of words that refer to the antediluvian epoch, and they're sort of markers of time for you as you see other passages supporting the antediluvian epoch as a testimony. So when we talk about the mighty ones and the men of renown, this is the giants, as you see that in the King James Version that these descriptions are for, which goes back to the Hebrew word Nephil and Nephilim. The mighty ones is Gibor, male plural, Giborim, and the men of renown goes back to 2 words jointly. One is Shem, same spelling and basis for the name of Shem as a patriarch in the Bible after the flood, but its meaning is being famous, of reputation, or infamous. And so these ones would have a reputation, but because they're Nephilim were also described as giant tyrants, it would be infamous of reputation, of doing horrible things. And the other word it goes back to is Shema, which isn't used in the Bible as a singular form, but Shemayim does as for heaven and heaven, singular, that it goes back to in Strong's Dictionary. So that means heavenly, I am as in plural as in the ones. So Nephil means the giant ones. Gibber is the mighty strong, so they're the mighty and the strong ones. And the renowned ones are the infamous ones and or the heavenly ones. And there's a connection back to the heavenly ones there because they're the sons of God. They are demigods. Right. So yeah, the full word means much more in its context to help us understand these beings. These were powerful warrior kings. These were rulers who usurped the kingships both before and after the flood. They imposed the polytheist religion of Enoch before the flood, and Enoch is the creator of astrology. This is Enoch, son of Cain, of the 7 sciences, that all of polytheism comes out of those sacred sciences, that Atlantis developed to a level unlike anywhere else in the world. And then you have this whole scenario being restarted again after the flood. And then we start to have that degradation of the knowledge again.
So the men of old, so for me, it's talking about giants that in a past tense form, that they already existed before this event. So am I thinking these were probably the Titans talked about in other cultures, and they were recreated with this incursion by the sons of God coming into the daughters of men?
Well, no, you have to be careful with that.
Okay.
So Titans in Greek mythology is understood as a god.
Okay.
And also a demigod. Right?
Right.
So Atlas is understood as a hero of Atlantis and a Titan. So you have these are the men of old. These are the ones being talked about before the flood, as seen from the time of Moses receiving the information. That's 1400 BC. So it's talking about the time before the flood.
Right.
You'll get men of similar kind of reputation, but different after the flood as well. So I don't think the language indicates there was a creation of giants before Genesis 6, but what it does tell us is that the sons of God went first to the daughters of men in Genesis 6, and then again afterwards. We just don't know whether that includes after the flood or not, on how many times they did the creation of giants. A lot of people do like to take Cain back to being the offspring of Satan and a Nephilim and creating giants at that point in time as well. That's a whole different show. But biblically, that's hard to have stand up unless you're really a good pretzel maker in terms of the allegorical interpretation and then ignoring scripture that would, even no matter how you try and reinterpret it, doesn't support it.
No, I think that's correct. So we see moving forward that after these giants were on the earth, God saw everything was wicked, and there came the flood of Noah. But we also read that there were giants before and after the flood. How do you, in your opinion, Gary, how do you feel that came about, that there was the second incursion? Were they in Sodom or, another part of the world? Because, I've researched that even in Native American lore, they talk about the star people who came and mated with their women and created giants. So it seems like it's kind of a universal thing. But I want your take on the sons of God, their second incursion. Where do you think this took place? At about what time after the flood?
Well, I think it takes place very early after the flood. So you have the Rephaim, who are basically understood as the giants after the flood. And maybe I should explain this just a touch.
Sure.
So the word Nephilim, Nephil being the singular, and it comes from Nephal, and the Nephilim of the fallen ones, which are the fallen angels, and their offspring demigods would have a similar name. So Nephilim is rooted in Nephilim, but they're distinct and it's different, and these are the demigods and talked about as the giants. So that's used in Genesis 6:4 for the word giant. It's used twice in Numbers 13:33 to describe the Anakim giants as giants, which is the Hebrew word Nephilim, which makes no sense. It's an embellishment of what the scouts saw in the land of Canaan. Not that they didn't see giants, but they understood the antediluvian giants were bigger and more terrible than the giants after the flood. And so they called them Nephilim, as it would have been in the Hebrew. But the Anakim, and that's the only three times that Nephilim shows up in the Bible. The word Rapha and its male plural Rephaim shows up 25 times in the Old Testament. These are the post-Diluvian giants. We get the Rephaim tribe specifically translated in the King James Bible as such. In Genesis 14 and Genesis 15, Genesis 14 is the War of Giants, because they're giants, and Genesis 15, they're part of the giant tribes that are part of the mighty 10, occupying the land of the covenant, as opposed to the mighty 7 that are only used in the time of the Exodus. And they're included as part of those tribes as well, as long as with the triple K, which were all giant tribes as well. Different story. I won't go into that one today, but just sort of keep that in mind. So the Anakim in Deuteronomy 2 are described as giants as well. But that word doesn't go back to Nephilim. It goes back to Repha and Rephaim, just as the Horim are Rapha, Rephaim, just as the Emim are, just as the Zamzuzim are. All the post-Diluvian giants are references after the flood as Rephaim, but in the embellished part, you have them, these terrified scouts, trying to scare and intimidate Israel from going into the land. And in the report, you get the Anakim, kings, and other peoples that are there as well, but the Anakim are distinct from the Amorites, from the Amalekites, and the other tribes that are listed there. And in Deuteronomy 1, when Moses is recapping the story, he's again making a distinction between the Anakim giants and those that are just taller than the Israelites, which are like the Amorites and the other tribes that were described in Numbers 13:33. What's being told here is a story of offsprings of the giants and human females that produced the patriarchless tribes, like the Amorites, like the Jebusites. There's 9 of them of the 12 Canaanite tribes. Just as Arba, the patriarch of the Anakim, doesn't show up in the Table of Nations. No giant patriarchs are shown in the Table of Nations. So when you have peoples that aren't showing up that show up that aren't part of the Table of Nations, like the Cadmonim, for example, you probably bet, and in my new book I'll walk through how we know these are giants. So we have Rephaim post-Diluvian giants, Nephilim as antediluvian giants. And that in itself suggests a distinction that there's probably the Rephaim weren't around before the flood, because they're not mentioned biblically before the flood, but they are mentioned after the flood, and that would indicate a second incursion, which is sort of where I fall on, and we start to answer other questions like these patriarchless nations, and that it answers why again, matches up well with the Ugaritic text, right? Where they're trying to, because they have fertility issues after the flood versus before the flood, they're wanting Baal and Ashtaroth to come back to create new demigods with them, and they're not permitted to. Now, originally you have giants angels that are swearing an oath in the book of Enoch to carry this out, the oath of Heramathena, to the end, with no matter what the consequences are. On Mount Hermon, we do get Mount Hermon in the Bible, but we don't get it named as the creation for the giants. But Mount Hermon is the area where King Og lives, right? The last of the Rephaim, the last of the giants after the flood, the last of the first generation of giants after the flood. And so we get the Bible talking about we get the Bible giving us hints that there is a second incursion, not necessarily at Mount Hermon. All we're told is the oath was sworn there. We know the Baalim have their assembly of gods there. But we're not told that the giants are created there. So they could be created somewhere, probably close to Mount Hermon. And if you have 7 mountains around the world, you might have cities that are associated with those mountains where some of these giants might be created. Sodom sort of rises to the occasion as being in the area where something was going on that might indicate giants were created there after the flood. And you have this filthy conversation that's being talked about in 2 Peter and Jude chapter 1 about the sins of the angels, and that they're they're wanting to fornicate at Sodom with strange flesh. And that strange flesh, it goes back to a Greek word that can mean a different kind, a different species, a different race, not just perhaps the homosexual aspect of it, which I'm not saying didn't go on, but there's something that's really interesting in terms of they're wanting to have sex with angels that they know have a changeling capability. So they either wanted to have a homosexual relationship with them, or they were going to supply a daughter, or they thought the angel may have been able to form into a female angel and they could have sex with them. They were seemingly, through past knowledge, understood how giants were created. And Sodom was the city of light. It was the city of rebellion. And that this knowledge indicates a foreknowledge that would have been going on before. Now, when the angels show up in the chapter before, in the Sodom and Gomorrah narrative, they're showing up with the angel of the Lord as humans who interact physically in the world, right?
Yeah.
And they're engaging with Abraham, and Abraham doesn't even recognize them as being an angel at first, and then realizes they are. But these individuals in Sodom, they obviously recognize that they are angels who are formed as men, because it's described of them that way. And so that indicates that they may have been trying to have another incursion to replace the dying out of the purebloods. And the Canaanite kings are probably Rephaim kings, and I make the case for that in the second book, and they're part of the War of Giants. And the cause of the War of Giants for not paying their tribute to the giant kings of Mesopotamia in Genesis 14. From a polytheist perspective, from a Gnostic perspective, they talk about, and I quote this in the first book, they look at Gomorrah as being the location of the antediluvian place and city where giants were created before the flood, and then replanted again at Sodom. So even in their belief system, they look at that was a city of light, a city of knowledge, and a city of the birth of giants after the flood. But because we know they did this all over the earth before the flood, the fallen angels, and that there are different civilizations both before and after the flood, then one suspects that would have happened sometime after Babel, after the dispersion around the world. But with the Babel narrative, we need to understand that the Rephaim are going to be created with either daughters that are in the Nimrodian empire of Babel and before, because by the time the Canaanites move to the land of Canaan that they're going to illegally settle in, Rephaim are already there.
Yeah.
Right? These Rephaim, as they're defined, are the aboriginals whom the Canaanites went to live amongst. So the only way that this can come about biblically is that there was daughters in the Nimrod Empire, probably maybe from Canaan in the beginning, who knows, but certainly afterwards that would have created the patriarchless branches, probably while in Canaan. But giants were created very early on, and seemingly in the Septuagint, which I'm not all that always a fan of, they actually say that Nimrod, in the accounting of Nimrod, made his reputation on killing the giants.
Yeah.
Which kind of makes sense in terms of like who was Nimrod afraid of? Who are the people who were afraid of? Why did they have to build a city with walls? Why were they trying to build a tower that would give them a name of reputation? They had to have done that for fear of being wiped from the face of the earth by the giants who had already created. So they had obviously picked off some daughters, or there was, which I don't tend to agree with, but I understand the case that if giants survived the flood, then some humans may have survived the flood with angelic help. I think they picked off the polytheists out of the Nimrod Empire, because Nimrod imposed that antediluvian mysticism on his empire. So he may have made daughters available to the fallen angels to create these giants, or they just picked them off from the crowd before they were able to be protected within the walls.
Right. Well, you covered a lot there. Good information, connecting more dots. My other question is, we see, in going back to Atlantis, the 10 kings, is there a connection with that in Revelation of 10 kings? And also, we read also in Revelation that the travelers will bury the army of Gog. Now, we know the travelers are the disembodied spirits of the Raphaim, if I'm correct. Is there a possibility that in the end times that the giants will return?
Oh, I think so. I think, nothing is new under the sun. What was will be again, and that everything sort of repeats itself. So somehow, some way, we're going to see the giants return. And in the passengers, I think or the travelers, as they're also called, it goes back to the Hebrew word abar. It's got a lot of meaning, but it also can mean crossover or passover, and used as such in the book of Job. And this happens in the time of the Gog War, when the mighty ones are being killed. So there's more going on there in the story. And Gog does not show up in the Table of Nations as a patriarch, and we already mentioned him as a son of Iapetus, as a parent god. And you have Gog and Magog, and Gog is the chief prince of Meshech, which is, the root word for Moscow today. And Magog is in the Bible through a descendant of Japheth who intermarried. Those peoples intermarried with giants in the Asia Minor area, just as the Canaanites did. And I think they named some of those sons, or biblical writers renamed them for their infamy for producing or intermarrying with giants. So you get Magog in there, but you don't get Gog. And Gog is defined biblically as a end time Antichrist figure. Not the Antichrist, the one that is going to be very much like an Antichrist, that the true Antichrist will point to as Antichrist, and create an Armageddon type of war in the end time. So we have Raphaim spirits, because Raphaim has 3 Hebrew words, one being the source word as being medicine or to heal. It's just as Raphael would be defined as healer of God, or God heals, because the giants were thought to have healing ability, that they could heal their own wounds and own limbs. So unless you killed them suddenly, like with taking off the head, they would be able to repair themselves and continue to fight or continue to live, or had a technology to do that. They're described as these healers in the Ugaritic text as well. The second word is 7496 from 7495, which is a demon spirit, an evil spirit, a shade, and 7497 is the giant. So I think all of those 3 words help define the larger context of who the Rephaim were. So if you're going to have an interaction of giants of the past giants in the world, and also understand those in the abyss will have been released before the midpoint of the last 7 years, and this war happens before the midpoint, because the second Exodus in chapter 39 is listed as later, and this is in the end time, and it lines up well with Joel 1 and 2 versus Joel 3, which is the Armageddon War, and it lines up very well with Revelation 9, the opening up of the abyss, the 200 million man war, and the counterfeit Armageddon, all for timing, which is required for Antichrist sort of pedigree. So you have to have an oiketerion, like angels take to make a human body to interact in this world. So Jude 1:6, where it says habitation, and the house in heaven in 2 Corinthians 5:2 is the only time oiketerion is used in the word Greek, and it means a dwelling place for the spirit. They needed a dwelling place for the spirit to hold their heavenly spirit, and to replace their habitation that is used in heaven, they needed a physical one, which is the soul and the body, to house their spirit so that they could interact and also create the giants. Well, if the disembodied spirits of giants are going to come back, they're going to need an Oiketarian. They're going to need a clone body. They're going to need some sort of technology, as would be like a teraphim or a talking idol to at least talk through, or they're going to need some sort of human, transhuman Oiketarian that forms that sort of technology, or we're going to have angels that were either held in stasis, as some people say, or another recreation. But I think we're going to have giants show up somehow. And we will also have the descendants of the giants through their dynastic beast kings and their royal bloodlines to form the seventh kingdom of beast kings for the end time, just as Revelation counts 7, Daniel 2 and 7 basically only count 4. That's because it happens after Assyria and after Egypt as part of it being the beast empires. I won't explain how you establish them at beast empires. It's kind of a show in itself to talk about the beast empires. But these are the ones that are going to be resurging the end time empire that comes out of the old Roman Empire. And in the Bible, we get 10 kings, 10 horns, 10 toes, all the same allegory for the same empire, which Antichrist rises amongst and then usurps it at the midpoint of the last 7 years. That's the same number as the 10 kings of Atlantis.
Right.
This was the golden time. This is the golden time that they want to reintroduce. It's the new Atlantis that the Rosicrucian Francis Bacon wrote a book about, where you have this end time new age, where you have a religion that merges with science and knowledge to have this new age and millennium that is the same sort of basis as you understand that polytheist belief where mysticism comes from, the 7 sacred sciences that merged with the knowledge of the gods, that armed with the Nephilim who produced the Atlantean kings and the greatest civilization in their mythos that there ever was, is the new Atlantis that they're planning for in the end time. So all of that sort of connects back into that allegory. And one of the reasons why I believe if you want to understand end time prophecy, you have to understand prehistory for the context and the types of events that are going to take place, and that nothing is new under the sun.
Right. And one of my the final question I have, and I asked other guests, in Daniel 2:43, when it says they shall mingle themselves with the seed of men, but they shall not cleave to one another. Who, in your opinion, are they?
Well, they are the bloodlines. There's 2 different ways of interpreting this, because they commingle their seed with humans. So they're different, right? This is a different race, either physically or spiritually or both. So my first understanding of that, because it's in the metallic empires,
right,
and it's talking about the 10 toes and the 10 kings of the end time, that they will commingle their seed with humankind. So the leaders are going to commingle with humans. So they're either the descendants of the giants, as in the royal families, or you've got the descendants that are somehow commingling with new giants that are created. So, but you've got 2 different groups, and just as you have 5 toes, you may have 5 different kinds or 2 different kinds of leaders as a separation, and an east and a west alignment as well within that separation. Just as you had Constantinople has a center and Rome has a religious center, and the 2 legs of the Iron Empire of Rome. But you can also, as you take that back to Hebrew, with that word mingle and commingle with the seed of humankind, you could interpret that not just as sort of physical, but spiritual, as in a possession. So when we talk about that Oiketarian concept, that you may have a possession of disembodied giants from the past that are going to share an Oiketarian body with one of these kings. And typically we understand possession as being a very violent thing, because you have 2 hosts that are fighting and the host doesn't want this demon spirit
Right.
to control its body, so it gets really kind of messy. But the demons who aren't in Sheol, where they believe their heaven is, and aren't in the abyss, they have to wander the earth, and they're like in dry places, and they're thirsty for a body, and they need a place of rest. They can only get a place of rest in a body. And even as we learn with some of Jesus' encounters, they'll even go into an animal if they have to, if they want to rest. So we have this understanding of possession, but in the occult, they also have two different concepts. You have an avatar-avatara effect, which Satan does as he enters into Judas biblically to give him power to continue to betray Jesus. But you also have an incarnation of polytheism where you have Vishnu, who makes many incarnations, and one of them is into Buddha. And Shiva does many incarnations as well, and into Narasimha. So they're sharing those bodies, but that is amicable, and the angel is providing great power. Now, bringing that back to the demonic spirit aspect of it, within the adepts, within the mysteries, the shamans, the high-level adepts, they believe they have the knowledge that they can bring in a demon spirit and share, and will receive additional knowledge and additional power. So in their belief system, whether or not that's true or the demon just totally takes right over, I mean, I don't know. I mean, because I've not been possessed, and I don't want to be possessed, and I'm not going to be looking to be possessed. I don't know exactly what happens there. But we also get another indication that this is going to be happening from a demonic perspective with Antichrist and the false prophet as examples, because at the time of Armageddon, you have these demons coming out of the mouths of the Antichrist and false prophet to collect the armies. Now, you can also define that in Greek, that's not a demon spirit that is coming out of the mouth. It can also be defined as the Antichrist and false prophet who may have demons in them, and maybe their image will be an oikotarian for a demon or a number of demon spirits as well. But he could be just commanding these spirits with his mouth, with his voice, because he has power over them to do his bidding, just as the false prophet would have something similar. So we have to look at Daniel 2:43 as being a very special passage, but there are a few interpretations of how you could understand that. But in somehow, some way, we are going to have descendants of giants, or bodiless spirits of giants, or another incursion of giants, or survival of giants that are going to impact the end time.
Wow. Well, we sure covered a lot. Peoples before Adam, Atlantis, the giants, the seven sages, Revelation. It's a mind-blowing. And I hope the listeners really appreciate this and take their notes. And Gary, once again, how do people find your book, your website, and so they can keep up to date with your new book coming up?
The best way is through my website, is Genesis6conspiracy.com. That's Genesis 6 with the number 6conspiracy.com. And my new book will be also marketed through that book. It'll still be on store shelves and things as well, and the Kindle version will be available as well. So that's the best way. And my new book, it's going to be the Genesis 6 Conspiracy Part 2. It's specifically designed for Christians to go deep. The first book is, I'm trying to draw in a lot of different peoples and show the consistency of the narratives out of prehistory and how that connects into end-time prophecy. This one I create specifically prehistory of the Bible, and go deep into things on giants and really develop the Rephaim aspect, the connection to the beast empires, the angelic hierarchical order and how they intersect. And walk through the giant wars, the patriarchless giants and things like that, the beast empires. And what I do is I connect prehistory to end time prophecy and show you a lot of the context and why that's important. So it's the subtitle's likely to be is how Rephaim and prehistory help define end time prophecy.
Awesome. It was great having you on. Thank you for coming to our podcast and sharing your knowledge with us. Many listeners, a little confusion on the day 6 people, the people before Adam, and I think we cleared that up a lot here. And we added some other elements of the giants in Revelation and Atlantis, and they all gel together once you go back and understand what you were speaking on, that we need to understand prehistory to get the fullness of what the Bible is really talking about.
Yeah. Prehistory is the context for everything that rolls out, and that's why I talked early on is that the creation of the Adamites is the resolution to the angelic rebellion. And if we don't understand that, we miss everything that happens afterwards. And we know angels were created before creation. As Psalms 104 talks about in the book of Job, where they're all united at this point in time. And you have the sons of God that are mentioned with the morning stars. So stars, angels, sons of God, and the host are all used interchangeably together throughout the Old Testament. And I have a great document on that, just as I do on that second incursion. If people want to know more about that second incursion, I have a great document on that. Or how we know the sons of God are angels and not Sethites. That's a separate document, so people can get a hold of me. So, yeah, I think this is very important to understand what happened, why everything's relevant in the Bible. It starts to answer questions about our complete history, what's going on today, and why these evil forces want to bring about the rendezvous with destiny, which is the end time. It's all contrived by them because they want the showdown.
Right. Totally agree with that. Thank you for coming on. Can you hold on for a second after we close this out?